Hi, my name's Peter Denton. I'm actually a Genesis tenant. I have been for about 45 years. Alack, alas, I think sums it up beautifully. The building here, right next to me, is actually Notting Hill's, if you like, head office in Killick Street. Well, I think they should kill the inspiration to merge the two, let alone the name of the street. The whole point is this. People have asked me tonight, including Notting Hill shareholders, would you believe, why am I here? And the answer is quite simple. I am not messianic, trying to be a bit of a good Samaritan. I know what Genesis are capable of, and indeed very much what they are incapable of. And I don't want to see the Notting Hill tenants and indeed leaseholders suffer what we in Genesis have suffered for so long. As it happens, one of the previous speakers this evening said that a guy the other day said that Genesis would asset strip them. Well, he should have used my name because that was me. Genesis regularly sell voids under the hammer and indeed in estate agents' windows. Why? Answer, they're so deeply in debt that they're using the revenue so accrued to pay off the interest on their debt. But unfortunately the debt is so big that it's like a dog running around and round and round in circles trying to chase its own tail, because the debt is so big that you can't catch up with the interest. But then Genesis probably don't even do simple algebra. So, do they lie? In my view, yes. It is a view. And do they con you? Yes, they do. I can give you a classic example. I stood to be one of their shareholders at one time. And bear in mind, a shareholder back then, you paid £1. Well, they took my £1, but never made me a shareholder. Now, that gives you an example. But I'll tell you a better one. There is a colleague of mine who also has a highly qualified, highly experienced background. And when Genesis were moving into part by part rent, i.e. skyscraper type thing, that, by the way, is my professional background. I never did social housing tower blocks, but office blocks, hotels, yes. And a hotel is not that different to a residential block. And when Genesis interviewed me, the answer was they turned me down because I didn't have the necessary skill sets. And yet I was higher qualified and more experienced than any of the people that were interviewing me. And indeed, as with my colleague, the same treatment. Well, if I didn't have the necessary skill sets and attributes to be on their board, does that mean that I was unfortunately telling the truth and telling things as they actually are? I have a strong suspicion that's probably the case. And I think anyone watching and listening to this video will feel the same way. Having said all that, quite recently Notting Hill did a walkabout where they were going around saying to their residents, what do you think of the merger? Well, one of the walkabouts was at the Tabernacle in Powis Square, and I was actually sitting there with a colleague, a Genesis colleague, at one of the tables on the patio, and Notting Hill management kept walking past and looking at me very quizzically. I know you, and in the end the penny dropped, and these middle management decided to come and talk to me, and they said, tell us who you are, we know you, but who are you? So I said, I'm Peter Denton, I live in a residential block of 126 flats. We have a residents association which I chair. I chair the Westminster Residents Panel, which is for everybody in Westminster, regardless of your tenure. I'm also a director of London Tenant Fed. And I've not yet heard of a single person in Genesis who has been consulted over the merger. And the jaws dropped on this middle management from Notting Hill. Are you saying that Genesis have lied to Notting Hill? And my answer was, join the club. You're getting the drift here, I think. There is a phrase, I wouldn't trust them as far as I would throw them. Well, I could throw them a considerable distance, but I wouldn't let them get that close. My advice to all of you is steer clear. I hope the message has come across loud and clear. I will happily speak and answer questions. I've just noticed I've got a reflection here. So there you are. Sorry, I'm amused by that. You're getting two people for the price of one. Anyway, that's beside the point. I go to many, many meetings, many congregations of people. And because of my knowledge on housing, right across London, I've even been up to Blackpool and at a conference and discussed housing there. I think the best example I can tell you is this. In all that experience, I've heard horror stories from people about their housing association, their TMO, their ALMO and all the rest of it. But I've never heard such a colossal accrual of complaints as I have heard against Genesis. Now, if you think about all the ALMOs, TMOs, housing association, co-ops, etc., 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 right across the UK, and yet I hear more complaints about Genesis than about all the others, that alone is significant to me. I really could go on. Why don't you ask me some questions? I'll give you an answer.
So, thanks for that, Peter. What about the partnership with Genesis and Capita? Because we, as residents, we're really concerned about Capita, which is a government does loads of outsourcing for governments. It collects TV licenses. It does electronic tagging for criminals. It collects speeding fines. It chases up students for student loan fees. We're really concerned about that, and that's really been hidden from. No one's mentioned anything about the link between Capita and Genesis, and I've done some research recently, and I found out that when the Genesis merged with the big umbrella of all these other various co-ops and housing trusts, they outsourced loads of it to Capita. Can you say anything about that?
I think I can actually. Something like, today's the 13th of September, something like Wednesday of last week, the Evening Standard in the business pages at the back actually had an article, I still think in Imperial by the way, and it was about 6 inches wide and 4 inches high, talking about Capita and basically saying that they're in deep trouble themselves. So with respect, I think the Evening Standard and any of your viewers watching this, if they call up that article on their computer, they will have the answer to your question far, far better than I could ever give. But you have to ask yourself this: why have Capita got their finger in every pie? Why don't they specialise? Is it mere coincidence that there's a fiscal return on the pies they've got their fingers in? Well, that of course is business, but they've got a lot of fingers in a lot of pies.
Yeah, quite.
Okay. Do you want another question?
Yeah, another question. We see Notting Hill as a hugely valuable asset stock of hugely valuable Victorian properties, one of which I live in myself, and they're dotted all around. You could say Kensington and Chelsea, not just Notting Hill. And what we're concerned about is the Housing Bill 2015. Basically, they said they were going to start paying people on housing benefits, disability benefits, and they were going to start paying the rents directly to the residents. And so many residents are getting in debt, and the Housing Association said in 2016 that 50% of evictions were from social housing.
Yes, I'm acting a bit of a cleft stick here, and I tell you why. There is an organisation for single parents called Gingerbread, and at one stage I chaired it, and I saw so many single parents who are financially constrained anyway. A child would come home from school crying its eyes out because it had been teased over poor quality trainers, for example, and the parent would spend the money on that, lose out on the rent, end up in arrears, get a letter, a notice of seeking eviction, etc., etc. And this kind of stress, I think Parliament should have said the money goes to the housing association, to the landlord, so that this kind of scenario would not be replicated. I saw all this in my days in chairing Genesis, but going back, chairing Gingerbread, but going back to the thing, I would have preferred to have said, are the residents getting value for the money? Are they getting a home which is undergoing cyclical repairs, as the tenancy agreement says, every 5 years? My own has not been done for something like a decade, and yet I'm paying for it. Is the money going on service charge for totally fictitious things? I mean, a neighbour of mine in a street property, on his service charge bill, he's got a garage. And when he challenged it with Genesis, saying, I haven't got a garage, I live in a street property. No, you don't. You live in an estate. We got you down as an estate. Well, the answer to that is, if you check an A to Z simplistically, or if you're computer literate, check on Google. You'll see it. It's a street property. They hung up on him. Now, this is an example where Genesis are prepared to take the money, but not prepared to take the effort to see if they're taking the money for the right reasons, and indeed the real and truthful reasons, and they're not bothering. And by the way, the same thing has happened to me. I'm having to pay service charge on premises and facilities which frankly do not exist. And the biggest laugh of all, and this is not a laugh, it's dead serious, immediately opposite my house, no more than 30 feet from my own front door, 40 feet at the maximum, there are 2 big wheelie bins with Westminster City Council logos on them. And those wheelie bins are for communal rubbish, paid for by my council tax. Why, therefore, is it appearing on Genesis service charge when I'm paying for that with the council tax? Okay, and this is an example of all the things that Genesis will not correct, even when it's drawn to their attention. Now, if the housing officers walked down the road and became cognizant of what their patch was all about, they would know that those wheelie bins have got Westminster City Council on them. But no, they can't even be bothered walking down the street. I chair several residents' associations. I make a bet with you. My housing officer, if they passed me in the street, they wouldn't know who the hell I was. But everybody in the area does.
That's great. Thank you, Peter.
I hope it was okay.